Welcome back to my channel. My name is Carly Stevens. This is Carly Stevens Books for all things writing, publishing, and indie author life. And I'm really excited to launch a new interview series today, all about what writers get wrong, starting with Chris Brown. So, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, and generally the expertise that you have that you'll share with us today?
Yeah, absolutely, Carly. Thanks for having me on. So my background was a Colorado Springs police officer for just shy of 7 years. Did just close to 4 years in patrol, and then I was selected to go to the Colorado Springs Metro Vice and Narcotics Intelligence Unit, where I spent just shy of 3 years before being medically retired, much to my dislike. But blessing in disguise in the long run. But my time in narcotics was by far the most rewarding and fun that I've ever had in my life. So that's just a quick down and dirty of that.
Okay, yeah. So I have so many questions about particularly the undercover work that you did during those. I assume it was just during those 3 years, kind of at the end there. So according to what we see on TV and what we read in books, sometimes there's this sense that anybody from the force, anybody in a department can be chosen for an undercover assignment. Is that true, or is there a particular kind of training or unit that you need to be part of before you can actually be chosen for that type of job?
Well, it comes down to a lot of things. No, it's not just if you want to go there, you can go there. A lot of it comes down to one, what is your reputation for your work ethic? You
Mm,
know, as a patrol officer, regardless of what investigative capacity you want to work in, it's all going to come down to, you know, what is your reputation? What is the quality of the police work that you do?
mm,
Are you educated in all the different case law updates that occur every single year? Are you familiar with really the big thing in narcotics is search and seizure case law?
mm,
Even for patrol, is really understanding the Fourth and Sixth Amendments, and how are you applying that to your ability, to your ability to investigate crime as a street cop. The other thing that the unit I worked for, and I would argue most what we call proactive policing units, gang units, impact units, narcotics units, is, are you taking the downtime on a patrol shift to go and hunt out the criminal element? Are you letting it? Are you being proactive versus reactive? Right? Are you
mm,
reacting to the calls for services that are coming in, which you can still generate good, um, more thorough investigations off those, but a lot of it's going to stem from your ability to go sniff out the criminal element. And so I was very blessed that right out of the training academy, I had mentors who were my training officers who kind of taught me the skill behind doing that proactive work. And really, a lot of it comes down to your ability to talk to people,
mm,
regardless of what crime you're investigating, no matter how bad it is. Your ability to talk to someone as a human being, whether they deserve it or not,
mm.
is what is going to open doors in terms of intelligence information or Mirandized statements that lead to convictions in court. And so, yeah, that's just a couple things. And then in my old unit, we were a big enough agency that, just a second here, let me. We were a big enough agency that we were able to host um, an actual what we called undercover school. So it would give officers who are working in other areas of the department an opportunity to see what it's like in a controlled environment, what
Oh,
working undercover is like. Um,
so were
so
those
that was
simulations, or
yeah,
what did
yeah,
that
it's
look
all
like?
scenario based. Well, not all scenario based. It's scenario based mixed with classroom. But basically kind of running you through a day in the life of a narcotics officer, an intel officer, a human trafficking officer,
Mm,
and are you comfortable with losing the uniform and the badge and the gun belt, and can you operate effectively in an environment where you don't have those comfort items on you at all times.
The kind of built-in
So
authority and things like that, yeah.
yeah, the built-in the authority presence that just comes naturally with wearing a uniform, and so that's another way for the unit to kind of weed out like who is actually geared for this type of work. Whether you want to do it or not, you may not be cut out for it, right? And there's nothing again, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a very unique type of work to do that. So yeah, those were kind of the things that the department I came from, and I would argue most are looking for when they're selecting people to go to a unit like that.
Okay, so everyone who ends up, participating in an undercover, situation would have begun as a patrol officer or
Yeah,
something like that first and developed a
yeah,
reputation for, being meticulous and being
yes,
fair and that kind of thing. Okay.
yes, yeah. Yeah, and then there's a testing process on top of that, right? So you actually go through oral board interviews. You do
Oh.
like a search warrant exercise where have you even written search warrants as a patrol officer? Now,
Mm,
in most large agencies, a line level police officer is going to have opportunities to dig into that. And I was very fortunate again that I had supervisors who fostered that in me very early in my career. And so, yeah, I got to test with about a dozen other officers. I was the most junior officer of the group when I was selected to come to the unit, but I had also worked some overtime shifts with the narcotics unit. So that's how you get to know them. They get to know
mhm.
you and kind of see the caliber of your work as well. So
So this was something that you aspired to, it sounds like, with the
yeah,
additional kinds of, things that you were pursuing as you were a patrol cop.
yeah. I again, my first training officer, he was very engaged in narcotics and narcotics work as a patrol officer, and he trained me. And I remember when I was in my field training exercise, the 3 months of field training that I got, we had a call for service where a recently graduated high schooler was caught with a heroin pipe. And we had two options at that time. We could have charged him, which would have had a significant impact on his ability to go to college, even for a drug paraphernalia charge. You know, he was 18 at that point, right? So um, we sat down and talked with him. The young guy was very emotional, and his father was a retired Marine colonel, and we basically said, hey, like, here's your choice, man. You can either take the ticket and potentially never have to tell your dad about this until whenever, or let's call your dad and let's get you the help that you need.
Mm.
um, and he opted for for his dad, even though that wasn't his first. He didn't want to disappoint his dad, but his dad came, and it was a great moment for me to see. It's not just about season dope and getting off the streets. It's about the potential lives that can be saved in doing so. And that was a great lesson in just talking to someone who was battling addiction,
Mm.
and just giving him the opportunity to get cleaned up. And never heard from him again. Who knows how he's doing? That was years and years ago. I hope and pray that that was a defining moment in his life. But yeah, so that was kind of one of the first times where I was like, this work is really important. It's not
Mm.
always publicized. It's not as glamorous as TV portrays it at times. But it's important work. Whether you agree with the concept of the full legalization of every narcotic substance or not, um, it's life saving work. It's just very different kind. So
Mm. Well, that leads me kind of perfectly into my next question because you said it's maybe not as glamorous as it always tends to appear on TV. So what are some of those things that writers, especially the ones the things that they get wrong repeatedly, like maybe the writers themselves have seen this play out on various TV shows and so they write another episode that does the same thing. What are some of those misconceptions?
I think as it relates specifically to like a narcotics detective or an undercover agent, they're often just pictured as just these total cowboys with no regard for the law. And, if they want to use drugs in undercover operations, like they can just literally be so melded into the criminal element that they lose themselves totally.
Mm,
That is not the case. Like there are very strict rules and SOPs regarding how you operate in that level, right? Like you are given a like different level of responsibility, but you're not just this lone wolf out there going and just I'm going to go buy a dime bag of crack this weekend. You know what I mean? Our operations were done as a team. They were done in a manner that were monitored at all times, not just for our safety, but for evidentiary value.
mm,
So it's not like we weren't just shooting from the hip. So everything that was done in a very calculated, planned manner, where the potential threats or um, the issues could arise were talked about and were prevented as much as possible. Now, granted, it's dangerous work, no matter how and you can try and mitigate risk all day, but you're still going to find yourself in some situations that you're like, oh man, this is hairy. But it's not just this free for all. Like a lot of the shows that I've seen specific to this type of work, it just makes them seem like all of a sudden you get promoted and you're just off on your own doing your own thing, and that
mm.
is not the
Right,
um,
following your gut or whatever into
yeah,
said
I mean,
situation.
intuition plays into it, but intuition is based on a lot of training and experience, right? Like that intuition grows based on those, those factors. And so, obviously, when you first enter into the undercover world, you're relying primarily on the training and experience of your coworkers and your partners,
Mm,
right? Because obviously, they're bringing years of wisdom to the table that help you articulate in your investigations why you know the things you know related to the narcotics criminal element, right? And then over time you work dozens if not hundreds of cases, and it just you become a subject matter expert in that area, but it doesn't happen overnight.
mm.
So
Yeah, that makes an enormous amount of sense. It would be dangerous for all involved, or that lone wolf mentality, that the cowboy kind of out on
yeah.
his own to do whatever you know, or they wanted to do.
Or the other one I got for you, Carly, is
Oh,
whenever
please.
they do a big drug bust, they take their knife, they jab it in there, and
Right, I've seen that
that
before.
never happens ever.
No,
And
not
every
once.
single movie, they do a bust, and it's like, no, nah, that's not how that works. Like, you take it to a controlled environment, depending on the kind of substance you're dealing with. You might be wearing like a closed respirator to even field test the substance, or it might, like fentanyl. I don't know if you know much about fentanyl, but it's highly lethal. It
Mm,
can kill you with micrograms exposure by inhaling it. Anytime towards the end of my career, and even now, the policy handling unknown white powdery substances is you just package it up,
mm.
put it in evidence, and you let the actual crime lab test it in an environment to where you don't risk exposing yourself. So
Makes a lot
yeah.
more sense than just stabbing into it and tasting it yourself,
Oh, that one
but it
drives me
has
crazy.
less pizzazz. That one
Yeah,
drives you nuts.
yeah, less pizzazz. It's like somehow wearing a badge just automatically it doesn't give you immunity from engaging in criminal activity. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
just
I was wondering
randomly.
about that, if there were any parameters, that would normally apply to law enforcement that get pushed out, like there's a certain level of stuff that you're allowed to do. But I guess it's just all laid out by your
It's
team.
all laid out by department policy, and even to get into the unit, you could go through all the testing and selection, but you have to get polygraphed again. And
Oh,
they
okay.
they polygraph, like you get polygraphed to become a police officer,
Mhm.
rightly so. But you get polygraphed to go into a unit like that
Mm,
because of the kind of work and the increased exposure to in large quantities of drugs and cash at times too. And so you also subject yourself to polygraphs at any time when you're in that unit. You
mm,
subject yourselves to more drug screenings when you're in that unit.
Right.
obviously all good accountability pieces that need to be in place, right? Um,
Makes absolute sense. Yeah, I mean,
yeah, but
if
people
somebody
don't
has a
realize that.
proclivity of toward,
Yeah,
wanting those things, it's just the
yeah.
availability is so much more.
It's more accessible. But the other thing that people understand is, within our own within my old unit, I mean, we have policies that you always had to submit evidence with another person.
Wait, do you submit not to, but with another person?
With always with another person.
Okay.
There's also rules, and that's across the board within most law enforcement agencies.
Hmm.
But when it came to cash, like that cash had to be counted by like three different tiers of supervision before everything was said and done. So again, the amount people don't realize the different tiers of accountability that are put in place to be above reproach because of the uniqueness of the work, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I
Because
mean, it's so
you're an
important if something
actor,
were to go to trial, you don't want any
yes,
potential hole in the chain of custody or anything like that to come
correct.
under scrutiny. Yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm. Well, see, this is I'm learning so much from you. I like this. So I've heard from several people, both in law enforcement and kind of near, law enforcement, that paperwork is one of those things that is huge in the actual job, like way more than it's ever portrayed on screen or in books. So I'm wondering, I mean, maybe it would be boring to show all of that, but do you have any feelings about how it should be included in a portrayal of law enforcement? And more particularly, if you have a multi-day undercover assignment, how do you actually deal with remembering all the stuff you need for paperwork?
that's one of the things I wanted to talk about was the paperwork, the documentation, right?
Mhm, right.
Um, Most people have never had the privilege of serving on a jury trial, right? To actually see the copious amounts of evidence and case documentation that go into making just an arrest in general, but when you're talking about like these high level, you know, like drug trafficking organizations is the common phrase we use, and or even like a homicide case, right, where you're it's potentially thousands upon thousands of pages of reports that get entered in and have to be
Mm,
sifted through. And at the end of the day, my philosophy and the philosophy of my supervisors was we're not out to make arrests, we're out to gain convictions, right? We
mm,
want these people to not just get put in handcuffs, we want them to eventually get put in prison because of the behavior that they're engaged in, right? And in order to do that, you have to have an ironclad case,
mm,
right? You actually have to have the supporting work behind that. And in order to do that, it requires so much time um, writing reports, but also sifting through data, right? Cell phones. Um, I remember I went to trial one time on a it was on one of my first drug cases that I had when I was a detective, and I seized a cell phone, and the defense raked me over the coals because I didn't write a warrant on the cell phone to find out what was in it. And what they do is they attacked your character, and they attacked your ability to be thorough when you don't do one thing. So, for instance, Detective Brown, why didn't you take the time to go in and write a warrant for that cell phone and then extract that data and go through it to either prove my client's innocence or guilt? And you sit there and you're like, oh man, oh crap, why didn't I do that? What other areas of this investigation were you not thorough on, Detective Brown? It wasn't that I wasn't thorough. I had enough to arrest him. I even had enough to prosecute him. But the way that the defense fights on behalf of their clients at times, not always, at times, is to attack your your ability to be thorough and to actually have sought out all the details of that case or investigation. Yeah, guess what I never did after then? I
Mm,
never I wrote a warrant for every phone I seized from then until the end of my career, and I had the assistance of our civilian intel analysts. That's another component of, they think that it's just one, like a one man show that does all this work. I had a team of people supporting me,
mm,
to include, big shout out to all the civilians out there who are supporting, the sworn law enforcement, because they were the ones where I would get a cell phone, I would download it, and then I would say, hey, I need you to sift through this data and make sense of it for me.
mm,
And that level of support that they provided, I couldn't have done anything in my career without them.
mm,
And it's just amazing how they help you keep. I had one case that I worked for 2.5 years. It was a Mexican national drug trafficking organization where we had dozens of arrests, pounds of seizures, thousands of dollars seized, and it spanned 2.5 years, and it wasn't even wrapped up when I left. Just the summary that me and my partner passed off to the FBI was 75 pages long, summarizing the work we had done in 2.5 years.
mm,
And a lot of that work I was able to put together in a summary because the civilian analysts that actually helped me make sense of it all, who put
mm.
flowcharts together, and the network webs and all that stuff. That is a real thing. When you see that like up on the board, it's just done digitally, and they have these massive printers so you can see the whole thing and you can plaster it up on the wall.
Oh, that's so
But
cool.
man, it is so labor intensive on the report writing. But if you're not
Mm,
thorough, you're gonna get you're gonna either one, miss something, or two, that's important for the case, lead you down to another important player in the organization, whatever it may be. But at the end of the day, you have to have it so that you can actually convict these guys. And what most people also don't know is, just because I wrote 100 pages in a narcotics investigation, the defense is going to go through and, based on, you know, legal precedents, they may be able to legally exclude 75% of my reports because it's hearsay, or, whatever,
mhm.
constitutional right of that defendant is going to violate, because whatever the scenario is, right? If they don't have the witness who said it, to whatever. um and so, the jury might not even be getting all the actual factual
Mm,
information I gathered because of court rules,
mm.
right? In
You
constitutional
almost have
rights,
to have
again, not.
2 convictions ready to go
You
so that
do.
if
Yeah.
half of it gets thrown out, you still have enough to stand on its own.
Correct.
Wow, okay, that is
Yeah.
huge.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, loads and loads and loads and loads of paperwork. But also, like, it was fascinating for me to get into, um, how many, I was writing Facebook warrants, and
Mm,
I learned how to write so many different kinds of warrants because of how the criminal element communicates with each other, right? If there's a platform you're communicating on, a warrant can be written and that data can be obtained, right? But it's a lot of work to get to that point. So, yeah, like with Facebook, for instance, we'd write a warrant, have to go through the entire approval process internally. Then it has to go to a judge, and the judge has to review it and find whether or not there's cause for you to go into this person's private account and take their information, right? A lot more information. Then you have to get the judge's signed warrant. You have to submit it through an internal link on Facebook's website, and then you wait 2 to 3, 4 weeks before they actually can compile the data and send it to you. So, and again, that's why these 1 hour shows don't show that, because you can't fit the amount of time it takes to complete these investigations into a 1 hour show, you
mm.
know? So, and unfortunately, then the public thinks that cops can just snap their fingers and they can get whatever they need to go get it done. So,
Right, there's this kind of unrealistic expectation for, well, why is it taking so long? They know who it is, why.
mhm,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
but that makes the it much clearer why it does take so long so often for things to go to trial when the offender is pretty obvious
Yep,
in
yep,
certain cases.
exactly. Yep, exactly.
Hmm. So you mentioned when I reached out to ask if you'd be willing to do this, that you like the show The Wire and how
Yes.
it's like it's outdated in some of its procedure and all that, but for the time it was relatively
Yeah,
accurate.
and I worked with one of the partners I worked with in my unit, and he was one of my trainers when I went to the narcotics unit. He was actually from the Baltimore area,
Hmm.
and he was an officer in one of the agencies out in that region, and he said that even with the inconsistencies, it was probably one of the better depictions of that kind of life. Now, even so, I don't think you really get to see the amount of the administrative end of those kinds of roles, right? It's 10% adrenaline for 90% boredom, right? It's that trade off almost
Mm.
where but man, that 10% is a lot of fun. Um, I tell people all the time. I said that job in narcotics was the best job I ever had. Like there will never be. I don't think there's anything that will ever compete with the amount of fun I had. And I take great joy and satisfaction in what I do now. But man, that was just a good time. Um, we some days we'd spend 12 hours doing mobile surveillance, following bad guys around, and
Mm.
I mean, the non glorious part of the job, having to take a piss in a cup because you can't lose your bandit. I mean, that is real, right? Like spending 10 hours in the backseat of your car on a 95-degree day, just sweating, like literally sweating like crazy because you got to wait. You're waiting for a load of drugs to show up or whatever it may be. Like that stuff does happen, and
Mm.
that's not the sexy part, but it's the necessary part to be effective for sure. So
I mean, it adds a little spice to your day. Maybe it's just not the spice that you wanted.
no, you always had to keep several changes of clothes depending on what you might encounter.
Hmm.
So whether it's you know changing up your appearance on the fly or whatever it may
Hmm.
be, you always had to be prepared. So
Oh, that's interesting.
yeah.
So, what do you like? What are some final thoughts and what you've read and what you've seen? What do you wish more writers understood about undercover police work and the people who actually engage in that job?
Yeah, it's depending on the way that a unit is structured, what part of the country you're in, things like that. Like my old unit, they're responsible for investigating every overdose death in the jurisdiction.
Mm.
Um, I left right as that was starting to go, but you're constantly interacting with the brokenness of the drug epidemic, right? You're dealing with the trail of tears that's left behind when a user can't get clean, when they can't find that sobriety that they desperately want. And you're picking up the pieces, right? You're having to go in and deal with the family members that are a wreck, right? Because they either found, the youngest overdose I think I had was 17 from heroin, and dealing like just the pain that the parents or loved ones have to deal with as a result of that. It's just crazy. One of my final cases was an overdose death that involved. It was a woman's son, and his girlfriend was also a user. She got arrested, went to prison, and they had a beautiful little girl. And she lost her son, and then she ended up taking custody of her granddaughter because she had no parents, and she pleaded with me, and she said, can you please try and find out who sold my son you know that last dose of heroin that killed him. And so ended up, she gave me his phone, and dug into the phone, was able to find out who the dealer was. But at the time in Colorado, they didn't want to prosecute that. There are certain states with laws that will allow you to prosecute the dealer if they sell them their fatal dose.
Oh wow.
um, Colorado does have that now, but it's very, very hard to prosecute that. Basically, without a confession from the person, like a direct confession saying, "Yep, I sold him that. I knew I sold him too much. I watched him enter it into his veins, and I knew it was going to kill him." Right, but I was able to find the guy, and I was able to take our gang unit and say, "Go hunt this guy down and find him." And they found him, and he had drugs on him. And so I was able to call the district attorney's office and say, "Listen, I know that the minimum or the maximum sentence on this guy is 2 years, but this is the wake of the trail he's left in his wake.
Mm.
Hammer him for the full two. That I need to give this mom something. Please do that." And they did. And I called that mom back and I said, "I'm sorry I couldn't do more, but know that he's going to spend the next 2 years of his life in prison." And I hope that's you have some closure from that. And it was. And so I don't think that writers, I say all that to say that I don't think writers understand the emotional impact that this kind of work has. I mean,
Mm.
policing in general, right? I mean, some of the worst days of my life were as a cop, just seeing the horrific things that people do to one another. But in the narcotics world, you're dealing with a lot of broken people I mean, that's all you're dealing with day in and day out is addicts, whether they want help or not, they're a mess. And unfortunately, when it costs them their lives, you're dealing with the wake that comes from that. And you're trying to be an objective investigator while also trying to provide some level of consolation to these families and loved ones. So that is something that never I don't ever see get addressed in I've seen a couple cop shows where they kind of go into the actual um, emotional and psychological impact that this line of work has on people, but not necessarily in the narcotic shows.
Mm.
um, so it's not like Training Day, you know what I mean? But anyway, I hope that helps put a little context to it. So
It absolutely does. So I appreciate so much that you're willing to take part of your afternoon and help writers like me understand better the work that you've done and the people who are doing it now, because we want to be faithful and we want to be true, even when we're telling stories that are technically not. We want to have the heart be correct. so
yeah, yeah.
so
Well, if you ever need to do a part two, let me know.
I might hit you up for a part two, because this was really interesting. But that's all I have for today anyway. If you liked this video, please like it, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification button. I'm really looking forward to talking to more experts in their field, and I could think of no one better to kick things off with than Chris Brown. So once again, thank you so much for being here. And for those of you watching, I'll see you next week.